Hello dear viewers, you are watching Ruslan Belov's channel, and this time we will go over the situation in Ukraine as of August 24th, 2025. A large number of important developments have accumulated over the course of the day, so let's get straight to the point. We will begin right from the combat zone and move along the entire length of the front. Let's start with perhaps one of the most dynamic, tense, and strategically important sectors, the Zaporizhzhia section of the front. Here, according to the agreements between Presidents Putin and Trump, in the event of peace talks or a ceasefire, the line of contact will be fixed along the actual positions on the ground. That is precisely why the Russian side fully understands that the more land Russian forces manage to seize in the coming days and months, the larger the share of territory that could eventually fall under the control of the Russian armed forces and Russia itself after the peace settlement. For this reason, heavy fighting is underway today in this area, with intense activity, as Russian troops are advancing northward from Kamenskoye towards Stepnogorsk. They are regaining control over areas lost during the recent Ukrainian counterattack. According to various mapping sources, including those aligned with Ukraine, the Russian armed forces have once again managed to expand their positions both within the settlement of Plavny and in the northeastern part of Kamenskoye. Step by step, the Russian army is closing in on Stepnogorsk, and one can predict intensified clashes here in the coming days. At this stage, it is difficult to say whether the Russian army will attempt a direct assault on Stepnogorsk, or whether Russian units will opt for a maneuver further northeast to bypass the town of Orikhiv, reducing the distance to the key supply routes running northwest of Orikhiv towards Zaporizhzhia, specifically the H08 highway. But if we look at the Zaporizhzhia sector as a whole, as we discussed in earlier reports, the offensive here is developing not only from the western side, not only from the southwest in the Stepnogorsk-Kamenskoye zone. The main thrust from the Russian side is still coming from the east, toward Huliaipol, advancing from the settlements of Velika Novosilka, Urozhain, and Komar. Here, under the Vostok, east grouping of forces, the Russian army is advancing across a broad front. Over the past day, fresh progress has again been reported. According to pro-Ukrainian mapping sources, Russian troops have now closed in tightly on the settlement of Kamyshevaka. Moreover, the same pro-Ukrainian sources already mark the southeastern sector of Kamyshevaka as a grey zone, which in practice means the storming of this settlement has effectively begun. Western-aligned analysts, of course, are raising alarms, noting that the Russian army is advancing vigorously and facing little serious resistance from the armed forces of Ukraine. Overall, the offensive toward Huliaipol and Pokrovsk bears some resemblance to an operation by the same Vostok grouping about a year ago, possibly a bit earlier, around the settlements of Vuhledar, Konstantinovka, and Novomikhailivka. Let me remind you that since the start of the special military operation, the Russian army made several attempts to storm Vuhledar from the south. In fact, a similar scenario could be seen recently when attempts were made to storm Huliaipol also from the south. Yet in both cases, both in 2022 and later, southern assaults yielded no tangible results for Russian troops. It was only when the Vostok grouping changed its approach and began moving toward Vuhledar from the east, starting from Stepne and Olenivka, then to Novomikhailivka, and later toward the T0524 road, that real success was achieved. At that time, about a year ago, when Russian forces managed to cut across the T0524 highway between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka, the entire Ukrainian defense on the southern Donetsk axis completely collapsed beyond repair. Now, a similar pattern seems to be forming again. Only this time, instead of Vuhledar, we are talking about Huliaipol, and instead of Konstantinovka, the key point is Pokrovsk. These two settlements are linked by the R85 road, which Russian forces are now advancing toward. The goal appears straightforward on paper: reach roughly the central part of this road, physically cut it off, split Pokrovsk and Huliaipol, and sever their supply lines. Judging by the plan, such an operation is intended to trigger the total collapse of the Ukrainian front on the Zaporizhzhia axis. In general, the momentum here is quite strong, but I would again like to emphasize and draw attention to the fact that the Russian army has covered only about 30% of the full distance. The offensive is still essentially in its opening phase. Based on the current pace, one might expect the battles for the Pokrovsky-Hulai pole line, and specifically the R85 road, to unfold either closer to the winter period, if any progress can still be made in winter at all, or in the spring of 2026. Perhaps under certain unexpected circumstances, Russian troops might manage to break through the defenses and reach this road by November, possibly late October. But if that happens, it would in itself indicate the complete collapse of Ukraine's defenses on the eastern flank of the Zaporizhzhia front. The Ukrainian side, as I've mentioned before, is trying to disrupt the Zaporizhzhia offensive by launching counterattacks on the western Donetsk axis, gathering forces in settlements such as Havrilivka and Ivanivka. For several days in a row, the Russian army has been carrying out heavy fire strikes on Ukrainian positions, both in Ivanivka and Havrilivka. The strikes are delivered using FAB bombs, multiple launch rocket systems, and tube artillery. The Russian side is seeking to prevent the buildup of Ukrainian assault units, which are then ferried across the Vovcha River to expand offensives towards settlements such as Tolstoy, Zorka, Podobny, Myrn, and Novokatska. Fierce battles continue in this sector. The Russian command clearly recognizes the critical importance of the Zaporizhzhia section of the front. That is why, for the second or even the third day in a row, we have seen no significant changes in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces here. This serves as an indicator that the line of contact in this area has generally stabilized. Now let's move to the Pokrovsky direction, from where a whole stream of noteworthy reports is coming in. Let me remind you that just yesterday or the day before, massive strikes began on Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, and Kostiantynivka. Russian aviation is operating with maximum intensity. Dozens of bombs are falling like continuous rain, with multiple explosions recorded. All this creates the impression that a new stage of fighting for the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka agglomerations is beginning. In addition, yesterday several pro-Russian analysts stated that assault operations had begun on the eastern approaches to Mirnohrad. As a result of the fighting, Russian units managed to capture a significant number of fortified areas in the fields east of Mirnohrad. These positions are of enormous importance. A wide network of long-term strongpoints of various configurations had been built around the city long ago. According to experts, part of these fortifications had already fallen under Russian control back on August 23rd. Moreover, the configuration of the front line suggests that certain Ukrainian units in this sector may have ended up partially encircled. However, starting on August 24th, completely new reports began to emerge from this area. In particular, materials of objective control were published. Strikes with guided aerial bombs and air raids on Ukrainian positions both in the eastern part of Mirnohrad and in the Shakov pocket. But the main thing was the widespread circulation from early morning of reports about an alleged Ukrainian breakthrough toward the settlements of Myrn and Malinivka. The reliability of this information is questionable, yet it is being discussed everywhere, from pro-Russian to pro-Ukrainian sources. At first it was said that the Ukrainian side employed the tactic of small assault groups, 2 or 3 fighters infiltrating between Russian positions from the direction of Mykolaiivka and the south of Novoekonomichne toward Myrn and Malinivka. What we are actually witnessing is Ukraine's adaptation to Russian army methods. Only a few weeks have passed since Russian forces themselves began applying such tactics in the northeast of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and now Ukrainians are using them as well. Initially this looked like an unverified post from the front line, but then footage with geolocation appeared from objective control. It showed Ukrainian assault groups moving through tree lines toward Myrn and Malinivka. Later, information surfaced, presumably a Ukrainian information push, claiming that Russian servicemen in Myrn were complaining of a difficult situation and requesting evacuation. Additional video clips were released showing captured Russian soldiers west of Malinivka. If we sum up everything that became known over the past 24 hours, it seems that Ukrainian units managed to wedge themselves between the seams of Russian defenses in the Novoekonomichne-Myrol-Lubivka area and gain a foothold near Myrn and Malinivka. They are now trying to hold this bridgehead. Whether to believe this information or not remains an open question, but it is being widely discussed. Moreover, some of the data is directly or indirectly confirmed by fairly authoritative pro-Russian sources. In any case, the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces can be seen as an attempt to sow panic and prevent further Russian advances in the breakthrough zone. Meanwhile, Russian units themselves continue to engage in heavy battles and, according to experts, have managed to close in tightly on Sofiivka and Shatters. Sources report that the eastern outskirts of Sofiivka are no more than 1.5 kilometers away. There is a possibility that assault attacks will begin as soon as tonight, after which the Shatters pocket will finally be sealed, leaving Ukrainian forces with no chance of escape. The battles here are extremely intense, and this particular sector can now be described as the arena of a decisive clash between the Russian and Ukrainian armies. The outcome of this confrontation will determine much: the prospects for negotiations, the course of a possible 2026 military campaign, and perhaps even the fate of Ukrainian resistance itself. Let us now turn to the Kostiantynivka direction. Here, the Russian army has intensified its offensive along the western arc of the Kleban-Beek reservoir. The main effort is focused on clearing Ukrainian fortifications north of Yablunivka and Oleksandro-Kalinove, essentially the last defensive line before the Kostiantynivka agglomeration. If this line can be breached quickly, Russian troops would gain the opportunity to advance along the H-20 highway toward Bereztok and the southwestern outskirts of Kostiantynivka, a development that would be an extremely unpleasant surprise for Ukrainian units. For several days now, heavy fighting has been raging in the southeastern districts of Kostiantynivka. At the same time, Russian forces are also pressing from the south, via Pleshcheyevka and Ivanopilia. As a result, the city is under attack from 3 directions simultaneously, and for the Ukrainian armed forces, the situation here is becoming critical. Now let's move to the Siversk sector. Today, reports arrived that Ukrainian units have finally withdrawn from the Serebryanka forest area. It is possible that small groups of 2 or 3 fighters remain in the forest, attempting to escape encirclement, but they are constantly being hit by drones, the heavy flamethrower system Sontsepiok, and rocket artillery. Overall, the battle for the Serebryanka forestry is over for Ukraine. It appears that the battle for the Zherebets-Siversky-Donets line is also nearing its conclusion. After consolidating and regrouping, the Russian army will most likely attempt to break through toward Yampil, Siversk and Dronivka in order to strike into the flank and rear of the Ukrainian grouping holding Siversk. This promises extremely unpredictable and severe consequences for the Ukrainian side. That's all for now, dear friends. Thank you for your attention. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and see you again soon.